Welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Fairweather, Director of Policy at Swords to Plowshares, and your facilitator for today's webinar on ending veteran homelessness. Where are we now? This webinar is organized by the Institute for Veteran Policy at Swords to Plowshares as part of our Veterans and Behavioral Health series, a training series for providers and advocates which explores the intersection of mental health and social justice issues among veterans. This online seminar will take a hard look at national efforts to end veteran homelessness and what still needs to be done. Opening Doors, the federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness, set forth an ambitious goal to alleviate veteran homelessness and poverty. Where are we now in our goal to prevent and end veteran homelessness? We will discuss the national and community efforts of the past 5 years, veterans populations most at risk, systemic responses in place, and strategies moving forward to get to functional zero. Some general housekeeping before we begin. 2 continuing education unit credits are available for MFT, LPCC, LEP, and LCSW professionals licensed in California. Please stay tuned until the end of the webinar for instructions on how to receive credit for today's webinar. During this webinar, you may type a question to the panelists or Swords to Plowshare staff at any time. Simply type your questions in the questions box on the right side of this webinar's display. At the end of the presentation, we will review the questions and comments posted and generate a discussion. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the Swords to Plowshares YouTube channel. We will email you copies of the PowerPoint following the presentation and notify you when the webinar is archived and available to watch. So, where are we now in our goal to prevent and end veteran homelessness? The online seminar will discuss veteran populations most at risk of experiencing homelessness and health outcomes, the national and community efforts of the past 5 years, systemic responses in place throughout communities in the United States, and strategies moving forward to address unmet needs. Our panelists for today's seminar are Baylee Crone, Executive Director of the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, Winston, Chief Operating Officer, Swords to Plowshares, and Megan Zottarelli, Senior Analyst at the Institute for Veteran Policy at Swords to Plowshares. Megan Zottarelli will present first on homeless populations most at risk of homelessness and associated health outcomes among homeless populations. Megan is the Senior Analyst at the Institute for Veteran Policy at Swords to Plowshares and manages research and data analysis of issues pertaining to veteran health care access and treatment quality, leads public education efforts, including this online behavioral health training series for providers and advocates, which explores the intersection of mental health and social justice issues among veterans. She also writes curricula and publications for behavioral health providers. Megan has a long history of working on mental health issues among underserved populations, including suicide prevention, mental health of underserved communities with HIV/AIDS, and poverty prevention among minority families. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thanks to the audience for joining us today. I'll be covering some of the identified veteran-specific pathways to homelessness, risk factors for homelessness, some generational characteristics and differences of veterans, and characteristics of aging veterans, women veterans, racial and ethnic minority veterans, bad paper veterans, etc., and related health outcomes. So as for identifying veterans by the numbers, there are 3 data sources that are widely used and relied upon. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development's point-in-time estimate, which uses an approximate count of homelessness during a single night in January of each year. The Homeless Management Information System, known as HMIS estimate, which is a count of sheltered homeless populations during a calendar year. And the Department of Veterans Affairs Community Homelessness Assessment, Local Education and Networking Group, so challenge report data. So HUD and the VA annually collaborate to produce and release a veteran-specific supplement to the annual Homeless Assessment Report to Congress, which incorporates data from multiple sources and is credited with being the most accurate. But all of these sources carry controversy as veterans migrate, they're in and out of systems, they're not properly identified as veterans within those systems, etc. But we'll go with what we know. So in 2015, more than 1 in 10 adults experiencing homelessness was a veteran, and on a single night in January 2015, almost 48,000 veterans were homeless. And that's the point in time estimate. So veteran homelessness dropped by 36%, so by more than 26,000 people between 2010 and 2015, with most of the decline in the number of veterans staying in unsheltered locations. So though veterans continue to remain overrepresented in the U.S. homeless population, there's certainly marked progress that has been made in ending veteran homelessness, which the other presenters, Baylee and Leon, will discuss. So differences in sheltered and unsheltered veteran homeless populations. 34% of homeless veterans were in unsheltered locations, compared with 28% of all homeless adults. The share of unsheltered homeless veterans has significantly dropped in recent years, yet it's important to note that unsheltered veterans are considered 3 times as likely to experience ongoing homelessness as sheltered veteran populations. And in terms of the population, unsheltered veterans differ from their sheltered counterparts. Research shows that they are older, they're more likely to be male, less likely to have income, more likely to be chronically homeless, and may be good candidates for intensive housing intervention. Among variation in states, California had the largest number of veterans experiencing homelessness. Homeless veterans in California represented 24% of the national homeless veteran population. 3 other states had at least 2,000 homeless veterans. So Florida had 8% of the share of national homeless veteran populations, New York with 5%, and Texas with 5% as well. In most states, homeless veterans were typically found in shelters. However, in 4 states, including California, the majority of homeless veterans were living in unsheltered locations. So that included California, Montana, Hawaii, and Mississippi. And overall, almost 70% reside in principal cities. So in states like California and New York, there's a high concentration in Los Angeles, which has the highest numbers of homeless veterans in the country, San Francisco, where we're located, and New York City, as well as other urban areas. So the conceptual model of risk factors for homelessness, it's very complex. It's based on an analysis of the individual pathways to homelessness. This one was done by Balsham and colleagues and reproduced by the Department of Labor when they did a literature review recently. And this depicts the relationship between veteran service and post-service experiences in homelessness. So based on the number of times each factor appeared in studies, the graphic highlights certain risk factors for veteran homelessness. This model highlights the complexity of factors which lead to homelessness and how some may be interrelated. So research on risk factors associated with veteran homelessness rely mostly on self-reported data, so findings are dependent on self-disclosure. But among the factors that contribute, there is significant mental health status, co-occurring substance abuse issues, and chronic illness, which heavily impact the likelihood of homelessness. The prevalence of mental health, substance abuse, and chronic medical problems among homeless veterans is higher than among housed veterans. Combat exposure, combat injury, military sexual trauma appear to directly affect and they impact a veteran's mental health and also impact the ability to secure and maintain a stable income. So protective factors that I want to mention. There are protective characteristics among veterans that should be expected to guard against homelessness, including specifically higher levels of education and historic family cohesion. Yet some studies, I thought it would be interesting to note, found that among homeless veterans, these predicted protections appear not to have the expected influence. So despite higher than average levels of education compared to their non-veteran homeless peers and a higher rate of past family cohesion, including a higher likelihood to be or have been married, some studies argue that veteran experiences of combat, trauma, and post-deployment readjustment, they outweigh the assumed protections of strong family support. Women veterans, interestingly, who have received a degree or are married show to mitigate the risk of homelessness. While the correlation between these protective factors and homelessness among veteran men is in question, it's not among women. But research shows that the protective effects of marriage for women veterans is not found to be because of actual marriage quality, although social support is very important to women, but because they are so much more likely to be the sole caregiver to their children. And while income is key for preventing and alleviating homelessness, research has found that access to a VA service-connected disability payment in particular is found to be a protective factor against homelessness. So the poverty correlation. We can't talk about homelessness without talking about poverty. Poverty is the greatest predictor of veteran homelessness. And this finding is not surprising, as homeless individuals, almost by definition, are impoverished and deprived of economic resources. Yet the comparisons of veterans to non-veterans in this category show veterans in poverty have a very slippery slope to homelessness. So while overall veterans are less likely to be poor, poor veterans are more likely to become homeless than non-veterans. For veteran men living in poverty, they are twice as likely as non-veteran counterparts living in poverty to become homeless. And for women, it's triple the risk when comparing women veterans in poverty with non-veteran women in poverty. And up to 15% of women veterans living in poverty will experience homelessness over the course of a year. So the number of veterans at the poverty level is increasing despite our best resource efforts. More than 40,000 homeless veterans receive compensation or pension benefits each month, but that's not enough to find affordable housing or to find supportive housing. And many veterans are ineligible for these benefits. So HUD released a new definition of chronic homelessness in December 2015, which became effective in January. So previously an individual was considered to be experiencing chronic homelessness when they had a disabling condition and had been continuously homeless for a year or more, or had at least 4 episodes of homelessness in the last 3 years. So the new definition is different. Firstly, in terms of the length of homelessness, those 4 episodes now have to add up to 12 months. Before, an individual could technically be homeless 4 different days over a 3-year period and still be classified as chronically homeless. Also, previously, people who exited institutional care facilities after spending fewer than 90 days in the facility would not have that period counted toward their homelessness, but now it is counted. And lastly, the time between periods of homelessness has now been defined as 7 nights in order for it to constitute an episode. So veterans are more likely than non-veterans to experience chronic homelessness as they experience disabling physical and psychological conditions incurred during service. Additionally, by definition, a chronically homeless individual has a disabling condition. That implies that homeless veterans are more likely than non-veteran homeless to receive that title if they have service-connected injuries. So these veterans have a high vulnerability and accompanying needs and very often cannot live independently and compete in regular rental markets. And then episodic homeless occurs when a veteran is having recurrent problems with housing and they're unstably housed. They may have seasonal minimum wage income or experience domestic problems, including violence and abuse that affect stable housing. So the homeless populations that I'll discuss, firstly, aging homeless veterans. Homeless veterans are most likely to be between the ages of 51 and 61 and post-Vietnam or Vietnam era. The number of homeless veterans over the age of 55 is projected to increase dramatically over the next 10 to 15 years. And among that age group, there's significant early onset health issues and age-adjusted mortality. The mean age of death among homeless veterans is 51 years old. Post-Vietnam era veterans represent a significant and growing portion of the veteran homeless population and yet are underserved by federal assistance programs. So for instance, eligibility for VA non-service connected pension benefits is limited to those veterans who served during wartime. And this huge segment of today's homeless veteran population are not eligible for these subsistence pensions. And we know access to this important benefit reduces the risk. Post-traumatic stress disorder is associated with high rates of morbidity and mortality and is one of the most common sequelae in veterans and links to homelessness. Many older veterans find that they have PTSD symptoms even 50 or more years after their wartime experience. And these veterans are significantly more likely to report poor general health, including cardiovascular disease, diabetes, gastrointestinal disease, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, musculoskeletal disorders, and autoimmune disease. These veterans place increased demands on healthcare systems, accessing primary mental and substance abuse care more frequently. And they have excess mortality rates as well as increased suicide risk, according to a study very recently published. So these homeless veterans had a presence of a serious health issue, hospitalization for alcohol abuse. They had alcohol dependency and long-term unemployment associated with increased risk of early onset death. So those were the primary factors linked to those mortality rates. So women veterans are the fastest growing cohort among homeless veterans, while homelessness among veteran men is decreasing. Issues stemming from military service are often the primary causal factors for their homelessness, and there may also be significant economic factors at play. Women veterans are up to 4 times more likely to experience homelessness than their civilian counterparts and account for 10% of homeless veterans. Compared to men, they are more likely to be unemployed, have dependent children, and homeless women veterans have higher rates of military sexual trauma than homeless veteran men. Disproportionately high number of homeless women veterans have a history of MST, so significantly higher than stably housed women veterans. Survivors may have an increased risk of anxiety, depression, and poor general health. Risk factors for PTSD, be socially isolated, and have trouble seeking and maintaining employment. So the economic effects of difficulties maintaining employment, that can extend into homelessness. Women with traumatic brain injury are up to 3 times more likely than men with TBI to be unemployed after deployment and are almost 7 times more likely to be homeless. Women, homeless veterans face barriers to accessing and using housing, such as a lack of awareness of available programs, a lack of family housing and child care support, and also concerns about public safety. So while we are making strides to adequately house women veterans, many facilities, they don't have the resources to address specific services or safety needs of women clients, including secure and separate living spaces and a staff that's competent in handling their specific trauma issues. Women veterans have shown to be less likely to access or even try to access services geared specifically to veterans, which may in turn increase their risk for homelessness. Also, many women don't self-identify as veterans and are not therefore linked to veteran-specific services. Racial and ethnic minority veterans, in particular African Americans and Hispanics, they are significantly overrepresented in the homeless veteran population. Almost 40% of all homeless are African American, and Black women are at increased odds of homelessness. Hispanic and Latino veterans are overrepresented as well. Veterans with bad paper, it's very important to mention. Those with less than honorable discharges from the military, they are commonly referred to as veterans with bad paper. Many of them have deployed to a war zone, many have physical and mental health injuries, yet the VA does not provide them health care, disability compensation, or adequate homelessness assistance. The VA system for determining eligibility is very complex and burdensome, and it prevents the VA from reaching its goal to effectively address the federal plan of ending veteran homelessness. So, are we doing all that we can to address homelessness? The VA's exclusion of these veterans with bad paper discharges directly impedes progress on this goal. The VA has applied its own discretionary policies, and it's not completely ruled by statute in applying this eligibility criteria and excluding them. Swords to Plowshares recently submitted a rulemaking petition to the VA and co-authored a white paper titled Underserved. It's linked to below, and I'll also send that out to you guys. And that argues that it is entirely within the VA's power to help these veterans, and they can change their own eligibility standards. So younger veterans. In recent years, younger veterans were becoming homeless at faster rates and are at higher risk of homelessness than prior era veterans. Veterans aged 18 to 30 are more than twice as likely to be homeless compared to non-veterans of the same age range, and the number of young homeless veterans is increasing, but they still only constitute 9% of the overall homeless veteran population. And health outcomes. Swords to Plowshares findings and other research is beginning to show that veterans are older than their chronological age. They are showing a very rapid and early onset disease course, and health conditions are more prevalent in homeless veterans than non-veteran homeless populations, and these rates increase over the period of time that they are homeless. The overwhelming majority of homeless veterans, up to 85%, have at least one chronic medical problem, compared to 50% of non-veteran homeless populations. The most common physical conditions are arthritis and joint pain, followed by hypertension, hepatitis, COPD, emphysema, diabetes, and heart disease. And in terms of mental health, depressive disorders are most common among veteran homeless populations, as well as alcohol dependence and abuse, drug abuse, and anxiety are also common. And as I mentioned earlier, among older veterans, there is an increased mortality and suicide risk. So the mortality rate is 4.5 times higher than the general population. And the mean age, as I mentioned, of death is estimated to be 51 years old. So homelessness increases the risk for early death, especially among older veterans and those with chronic medical problems. Among the 25 to 44 year age group, drug overdose is 16 times higher than the general population. Among the 45 to 64 year age group, cancer is 2 times higher than the general population, and heart disease is 4 times higher than the general population. And resource constraints. Without stable housing and access to supports, most homeless veterans cycle from one emergency system to the next. So to shelters, public and VA hospitals, psychiatric institutions, detox centers, and back to the streets unceasingly. In both human and economic terms, this is at an enormous cost. This leads to an institutional circuit where a series of institutions, they provide those sequential stints of housing instead of providing a stable, supportive, community-based housing. So homeless veterans are disproportionately, they rely on emergency departments and hospitalizations for care. As one study done in 2012 cited, 1/3 had at least one emergency visit in that year. That's 3 times higher than the US norm, and 12% had 4 or more visits. That's 30% higher than non-veteran homeless. 23% were hospitalized in 2014, over 2 times more likely and at younger ages than non-veteran homeless, and the admissions were 36% longer and cost 20% more. Chronic homeless individuals, they are dependent on and at the mercy of these systems. Overall, it appears that for chronically homeless and those with severe mental health issues, public costs are higher. And they're also the most visible population to examine these public service costs. The criminal justice system, the relationship between homeless veteran status and veteran incarceration is significant. Inmates of local jails identifying as homeless have a cyclical pattern of intermittent homelessness and incarceration. But keep in mind also that many of these activities of the homeless are criminalized, especially loitering and theft crimes, and thus increases their incarceration risk. And in state and federal prisons, keep in mind the geography of where these facilities are located, so often remotely and away from the veteran inmates community, social support and ties that are crucial for reintegration upon release. These are often disrupted. A study that was done back in 2008 found that veteran inmates of prison are more likely to become homeless within 30 days of release and remain homeless over longer periods of time. And the Department of Public Works costs are considerable when veterans are not adequately sheltered or in supportive housing, as one could expect. The cost savings of supportive housing for homeless veterans are considerable. For the chronic homeless population, permanent supportive housing reduces the burden on these systems and saves taxpayers thousands and thousands of dollars. For homeless veterans, those in domestic violence situations, those homeless families, and those who have been homeless for a lesser amount of time, short-term interventions have shown to be cost-effective since they are less likely to receive acute care public health services. A key cost saving outcome of housing interventions for homeless veterans from 2010 to 2012, based on a study done that year, there was a 36% reduction in emergency department use, a 34% reduction in hospitalizations, and a savings of up to $7.2 million. VA health costs for those receiving HUD-VASH, which we'll get into further in the next presentation, they're estimated to be decreased by 34% from 1 year prior to move-in to the 1 year following HUD-VASH move-in. And the cost decrease held steady during the second year. So this cost reduction was driven primarily by decreases in the utilization of inpatient services, the cost of which decreased by 66% from 1 year prior to 1 year post-move-in for these populations. And with that, this concludes my presentation. Thank you again for joining me. I'm available for questions at the end of the presentations, and now I will turn it over to Amy.
Thank you, Megan. Okay, so we see we've got a high acuity among this group. So our next panelist we will welcome is Baylee Crone. Baylee is the Executive Director of the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. She is a nationally recognized voice in efforts to end homelessness. In this capacity, she provides leadership and management over NCHV's technical assistance, policy, and communications activities, and executes NCHV's mission and goals. There are member agencies throughout the country who serve veteran homeless who benefit from these services. As the only national organization solely committed to ending veteran homelessness, NCHV is a trusted source of information, training, guidance for community organizations serving these veterans, but also to philanthropic and corporate partners, to government employees at the state, local, and national level. Welcome, Baylee.
Thank you very much, Amy and Megan. Really great job covering a really wide spectrum of information there. My slides are going to be pulled up in just a second here, but while I'm pulling these up, what I'm going to do now for the next little bit of time is take us back a little bit, both in time and then into a different level of looking at this same issue by examining a little bit of where we came from within this movement to help veterans who are homeless get off the streets and into stable housing, how it started, and really how it's grown and magnified over the last 5 years in particular, both in resourcing and the level of coordination. I want to give you a sense of what the community systems look like that are surrounding veterans in need of care, that are helping to move veterans off of the streets into stable housing as quickly as possible, and help those veterans and their families that find themselves at high risk prevent falling into homelessness in the first place. But first, let me tell you a little bit about my organization, the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. NCHV has been around we're in our 26th year now. We work with community agencies all across the country to help them really just do the work that they do even better. We recognize that local community agencies are doing the hard work of serving veterans in need every single day, and our whole mission is to make sure we're advocating on behalf of them so they have the resources and the information they need to best serve those veterans. We actually started with a group of Vietnam-era veterans that looked around them and thought, it seems like veterans are disproportionately represented within the homeless population. And they were right. And actually, we have some of our origins in Swords to Plowshares, so we've been connected since the very beginning in the early 90s. In the early 90s, NCHV moved here to Washington, D.C., where we've been ever since. And we've grown and changed quite a bit since the early 90s. Now, if you take a look at this slide, I want to talk to you a little bit about who the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans serves, because I think that it's very symbolic of where we're going to go within the conversation today, and really what I'm going to charge each of you with thinking through about the role that you individually play in your community and what role you can play. When NCHV started, we were a group of awesome ragtag community providers that wanted to help veterans who were on the streets access some sort of services, and really there wasn't a whole lot there to support them except for these dedicated individuals that wanted to serve veterans. As you fast forward over time, we've seen a growth in buy-in to the importance of helping veterans who are homeless and at risk, by providers that are non-traditional to our space. So maybe some of the veteran groups that weren't always involved in serving the homeless, and maybe some homeless service agencies that hadn't ever realized that they were working with veterans or hadn't focused in on that subpopulation within the individuals who are homeless or at risk they were serving. More recently, we're seeing that investment both in time and in resourcing with other social service partners that maybe weren't ever involved in the homelessness space or hadn't worked with veterans in the past. This in many ways epitomizes our talk today. We're going to build upon the foundations of our shared history, and we're going to integrate some new tools and programs to deepen our reach and our impact. We're also going to bring in those non-traditional partners who play that valuable role in our effort to build a sustainable response system so that we can meet the needs of all veterans who come into our care. As we go through these slides, I'm going to ask you to think about which of these groups you belong to and really what your individual charge is within your organization and just within you. If you're an agency or if you're working at an agency that has a long history of serving veterans, okay, how do you better connect to those agencies that are focusing on homeless services? Or how do you better work with your local employers or your business improvement district or your mayor's office to help them identify a role that they can play? If you're working at a social services agency that has already served individuals who are homeless or works on the prevention side, how can you think through about how your program is already serving veterans who are homeless, or how you can improve those services within your agency? How can you be that advocate for making sure that you address the needs of veterans who come into your program? If you're an interested advocate and you're wanting to learn more, this is your opportunity to think through, where can I best meet a need? There's a role for every person to play in this effort, and we hope you'll join us in that. So let's go back a little bit to the beginnings of this work. In the early 1990s, there wasn't a whole lot there serving veterans who were homeless, except for the providers that were dedicated to making sure they could make change in every veteran's life who came into their door. In the early 90s, we helped draft the Grant and Per Diem program, which was the first program to really serve veterans who were homeless on a community basis. This program, if you're not familiar with Grant and Per Diem, allows individuals who are homeless, veterans who are homeless, to come in for services for up to 2 years. It can be a residential program, often is. They look a little bit different depending on your community. Sometimes the Grant and Per Diem program has maybe 3 or 5 beds that are scattered in different locations that offer that transitional place out of homelessness. In other communities, they'll have larger settings where you might have something that looks similar to what you might have encountered when you were in boot camp, where you've got a bunch of veterans who are all living in one place going through this program. Veterans can stay in it for up to 2 years, but the average across the country differs depending on the individual's need and how long they need to be in that program before they can move to their next step. Also in these early days, we had the very first stand-down grants that emerged. The beginning of Stand Down offered an opportunity for veterans to get a hand up out of homelessness by moving back behind the front lines to a place where they could rest and connect to resources. Now, the first Stand Down that started in San Diego has blossomed across the country, and now we see Stand Downs being held in pretty much every state in the country, whether it's connected to the VA Medical Center, working with the local American Job Center, or a community-based effort trying to help veterans connect to resources. The heart and soul of that Stand Down is helping people get back connected to the last time when they felt really good about who they are and you know, what the world meant to them before they had this experience of homelessness. It's a way for veterans to be together, get connected to resources, but really get connected back to themselves. And Stand Down started in this early time. Around the same time, the Department of Labor put forward the first Homeless Veteran Reintegration Program, HVRP grants. Now, the whole goal of that program, being from the Department of Labor, was to help veterans who were homeless connect to meaningful employment within their competitive labor market, and also for those agencies that received this grant to help facilitate a better service network within their local community. You'll see the chart up here on the screen, and I included this just to show you that in the beginning, even though we had the origins of these programs, there still wasn't much capacity, but the community agencies that received these grants did a lot with little. So let's fast forward a couple of years. In 2009, the President said, "Until we reach a day when not a single veteran sleeps on our nation's streets, our work remains unfinished." And that statement changed the world as we knew it. You'll see the President here when he was the junior senator from Illinois with the NCHV staff. This is prior to him becoming the President of the United States. And when he said these words, it changed the work that we do, because it put forward the reality that not only is homelessness not something that should ever happen, but veterans in particular should never have to experience the tragedy of homelessness. Now, any of us who have been involved in politics for any particular period of time, and having lived in Washington, D.C. for a significant amount of time, I've seen a lot of it, know that oftentimes a statement made by a political figure can be heard, can cause some energy, and then can quickly fizzle out. But in this case, that didn't happen, especially for veterans. In May of 2009, the President charged the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, USICH, with coming up with a plan to end all homelessness. With this charge, USICH created the Federal Strategic Plan to Prevent and End Homelessness, sometimes called the Plan, also called Opening Doors. Now, this report didn't come out of thin air, and if you were working in this work back in 2009 and 2010, you might have been involved in this process. In 2010, USICH convened a series of work groups on subtopics that built out the structure of this plan. These work groups included veterans, but they also included other groups like families, youth, and individuals experiencing chronic homelessness. They held a series of regional stakeholder meetings, followed by several opportunities for them to speak out in the community and gather input both online and within local communities. So it brought around 1,000 stakeholders, and that doesn't include everyone they talked to online. So what did they find? Because you can gather a lot of information, but what really comes of it? First, the agencies that were involved in the council, so the federal agencies that were charged with this effort, recognized that they had to agree on a few basic principles before they got started. Any of the solutions they proposed to be effective needed to be driven by proven solutions and data. They needed to be cost-effective, but also implementable. Importantly, and this is the piece we talk about all the time now, they needed to be scalable. So if they were going to identify interventions that would work to serve people who were homeless, they had to be replicable in other communities. Later in today's webinar, Leon's going to talk about some of these data-driven, scalable, cost-effective interventions and tools. So I won't get into them too much here. So USICH releases Opening Doors. And there are several charges in there, starting with the job of ending and preventing homelessness for veterans within 5 years. Now again, like many things that might come out of Washington, D.C., it could have been put out, drawn some enthusiasm, and then fallen off of the radar. In this case, that didn't happen. VA Secretary Eric Shinseki came forward and said, okay, we will take that charge, and we're going to do it by the end of 2015. Now, for advocates working in this field, you know, now being into 2016, that we didn't quite meet that goal, but that's okay. What mattered more was setting a timeline and saying we need to have enthusiasm around this effort in order to be impactful. And that set off a series of events that leads us to where we are now. But it was going to take more than the Department of Veteran Affairs saying we will leverage our resources, we're going to do what we can to be partners in this effort. And they did develop a plan with an effort to end all homelessness for veterans by the end of 2015. But it couldn't just be them. We started to see buy-in from other federal agencies, including the Department of Labor and Housing and Urban Development. I want to talk in particular about Sean Donovan and Housing and Urban Development and their level of buy-in, because I think it's important. We talked a little bit earlier about the importance of good data and about the point-in-time count. And a lot of folks might not realize that the point-in-time count, if you've ever participated in it, and if you haven't, I encourage you next year in January and February to sign up with your continuum of care to go out and be part of this survey of all homeless persons in your community. It's a great opportunity to just get connected and to get a better sense of the work that we do every day. So for the first time in 2009, the Department of Housing and Urban Development started including veteran data in their point-in-time count. And here's why that's significant. Before that time, the Department of Veteran Affairs, through the Challenge Report, pulled together data on veterans who were homeless based on those who were accessing VA services, homeless services, and the input from the VA workers who were serving those veterans who were homeless. They used this report to identify some of the major unmet needs by VISN. Now, this report was also used for us to keep a general benchmark on what the numbers of homeless veterans were, but it wasn't necessarily meant for that purpose. It was really used to try to identify those major unmet needs. Now, we use that as our benchmark for understanding our progress in ending veteran homelessness, but it wasn't fully for that purpose and didn't have the solid methodology behind it for data counting that HUD does for the point-in-time count. So in 2009, we saw the first veteran supplement to the AHAR, the Annual Homeless Assessment Report. And in this, showed that using point-in-time count data, that veterans were disproportionately represented within the homeless population, something that we knew anecdotally, but here, for the first time, we had pretty good, much improved data saying that veterans were overrepresented within the homeless population. That year, they found that over 75,000 veterans were homeless at one point in time. They also found that over 130,000 veterans spent at least one night in shelter or transitional housing over the course of the year. Now, these are really important numbers, but as important as these numbers are the report itself. Charged with working together to help end homelessness for veterans, the Department of Veteran Affairs and the Department of Housing and Urban Development realized that they needed a better handle on their own data and programs. This 2009 report meant that continuums of care were finally asking an important question in their one-night point-in-time count. Did you serve in the U.S. Armed Forces? Now, we know that it took a couple of years. If any of you have been involved in your point-in-time count, you know that it's taken a couple of years programs to learn how to ask that question the right way, how to not make assumptions about the individual you're talking to. Like if you're talking to a young woman, oftentimes folks might skip asking that question, and through better training, now they're learning that there's a significant number of women who served in the military, and you need to ask that question to everybody so that you're getting an accurate representation of that population. So this was important because it showed that agencies beyond the Department of Veteran Affairs recognized that we could make a significant impact in the lives of veterans who are experiencing homelessness if we worked together to leverage housing resources and to bring employment to the table. So what did that look like in terms of resourcing? I'm going to skip around a little bit on these because I want to start with where we began. The Grant and Per Diem program, there was the recognition that that program needed to continue to be robustly funded under the Department of Veteran Affairs because that was the access point at this time for veterans who were leaving the streets to connect back into care, to connect to the medical center, to connect to services, other veterans, and ultimately to permanent housing placement. And that was huge. We also saw for the first time that we needed to understand better the needs of those chronically homeless veterans who were going to need a more intensive intervention. And during this time, you finally saw the growth of the HUD-VASH program, which offers the case management support of a VA medical center staff person, along with the supportive housing voucher coming from the Housing and Urban Development local site, so from your public housing authority. This program has grown by 10,000 vouchers every year, with the exception of 2012 and 2011 and 2016, when those allocations were a little bit lower, but still very significant. So we were recognizing at this point, okay, well, within the Department of Veteran Affairs, we needed to offer this bridge out of homelessness through transitional housing. We needed to serve the needs of those veterans who were chronically homeless, who had really significant service needs, who would benefit not just from a supportive housing intervention, but from long-term case management connected directly to the medical center. We also realized that the connection to longer-term stability involved back to income and employment. The Homeless Veteran Reintegration Program, HVRP, which as I mentioned earlier is a community-based program from the Department of Labor, continued at an authorization around $38 million during this time. It steadily grew over time, but still remained below its full authorization amount. One piece that was brand new in this era was the recognition that we had to look better at what we needed to do to prevent homelessness in the first place. So we had this two-pronged effort of making sure we were bringing veterans off the street into care, connecting them to services, but at the same time stopping the flow of homelessness into communities from the other side. Because if we didn't do both at the same time, then we weren't offering the best service to veterans in our care. At this point, you saw the development and the growth of the supportive services for veteran families, the SSVF program. And although it says families in the name, individual veterans are served by this as well. So as I mentioned earlier, what happened when we reached the end of 2015? There was worry across the country that we had set a goal of ending veteran homelessness by the end of 2015. And once we reached, the last hour in December, once we reached January 1, 2016, would we lose the support of this national effort to end homelessness for veterans? Would it go back to the early 90s when it was just the group of advocates that were fully dedicated to this issue? And we realized, no, we weren't going to lose that commitment for the long term. An example of this long-going commitment, you'll see some photos here from our last annual conference and from our housing summit that we held last year. And you'll see down at the bottom, Department of Labor Secretary Perez. I think he offers a fabulous example of making sure that Department of Labor showed their longer-term commitment to serving veterans who were homeless, to helping them access income as a hand up away from homelessness and towards stability. He offered, through his agency, refocusing guidance to the Disabled Veterans Outreach Program Specialist, your local DVOPs, and I'm going to give you a lot of acronyms. They're located at your American Job Centers, your AJCs. This was done through Veteran Program Letter VPL 03-14. And what this did was require that those DVOPs only serve veterans with significant barriers to employment. And that's important because that included those veterans who were experiencing homelessness. So for the first time, we had very clear guidance from the Department of Labor telling local folks working with veterans within the American workforce system that you have to serve and you have to assist veterans who are homeless with returning to employment. That's one example of that continued support, moving through the end of 2015 and going beyond the beginning of this year, where the agencies have showed that longer-standing commitment. But something else I want to talk about briefly, because it'll lead us into what Leon's going to talk about important interventions and how we understand and define an end to veteran homelessness in communities, is the buy-in from USICH and the changes that they made to that original plan, to that opening doors plan. Now in 2015, USICH Director Matthew Doherty made some updates to the federal strategic plan to end and prevent homelessness. You'll see that we still maintain the same goal of preventing and ending veteran homelessness among veterans by the end of 2015, but the commitment remains. One of the important additions to this, and we're going to get to it in a minute, was the articulation of what it meant to end homelessness for any population, including for veterans. And it didn't mean that we reached an absolute zero and then we gave up. It emphasized the importance of building sustainable systems so that individuals who experienced homelessness, including veterans, would have a place to turn for the long term. So what did that mean for resources? Now, we talked a little bit earlier about these 4 programs, and we call them our Cornerstone Programs. And I'm just going to touch on them briefly. Grant and per diem maintain the stability of funding, and that's something that we had to fight for. And if you have a grant and per diem program, we could use, your help in making sure that we maintain this critical resource. Now, we agree that as these other programs have grown, we need to help the grant and per diem program modernize so it's best able to meet the local community need. The HVRP program still remains underfunded, not all the way up to its current authorization level, but that program is expanding across the country to serve those veterans who are most in need of employment services, and they've maintained an average cost for placement of around $2,700 to $2,900, which, if you think about helping a veteran who's homeless get into a competitive workforce job, that's pretty impressive. Through fiscal year 2016, the HUD-VASH program grew to more than 86,000 HUD-VASH vouchers. This included special notices that were project-based to spur new development, and a notice for vouchers to be awarded on tribal lands with help from the Office of Rural Health. Importantly, the SSVF program had $300 million distributed across the country, with another $300 million in surge funding for those communities with the highest need. So why was all of this happening? What was the goal here? Now we have, and Megan mentioned this earlier, that with the systems we have, there's so many pieces that are consistently moving. And if you look at this slide and you think of these as being bubbles that bounce off of one another, balls that bounce off of one another, when you're serving a veteran in need, it's highly likely that your programs are going to come into contact with other programs for a brief moment while you're serving that veteran or while you're trying to meet one of their needs. And in an ideal situation, you could connect, you could bump up against that program right when you needed to. But what happens sometimes is that individual veterans in need of care fall through these cracks when the programs move away from one another and they're not in full coordination all the time. And that's a real fear that we've had because of lack of coordination and because of lack of resourcing. Now, this model that you see is a way for us to try to address or prevent that institutional circuit that was mentioned earlier. So how do you connect a veteran straight to the full spectrum of resources that they're going to need based on their individual needs profile so that they not only are able to obtain housing, but they can maintain it for the long term? So I mentioned back in the very beginning that we've got organizations that have been long-standing members of NCHV and providers serving veterans who are homeless. We also have those agencies that have served homeless populations or at-risk populations that are more invested in serving veterans now. Now, the third part of that equation is those individuals or those organizations, entities, elected officials that would like to have some sort of role to play, but they maybe weren't always involved in this effort. And that's where we get a couple of these coming up initiatives here, one of them being the Mayor's Challenge. Now, this was an initiative that was originally conceptualized by the National League of Cities, and because of the importance of it, was adopted by the Joining Forces Initiative in partnership with HUD. And the goal was to try to get local mayors' offices connected to the effort to end homelessness for veterans in their communities. You'll see here some of the major strategies and principles, and I encourage you to go to the National League of Cities site and to the HUD website for the Mayor's Challenge, because if you have a mayor, if you're in one of these communities in California and this is your mayor and you think, well, I'm not really sure what my mayor's office is currently doing. They're signed up, but I want to learn more about how they're actually invested. Some of those resources available that have been developed in support of the Mayor's Challenge will help you make a more solid and constructive conversation with your mayor's office to make sure that they're invested in a real and meaningful way. Another initiative that has helped bring together community partners is the 25 Cities Initiative. Now, this is an effort to target those communities with the highest density of veterans who are homeless, with really high need profiles, and help them better coordinate their systems so that they can best meet the needs of veterans in those communities. This built into the 0 to 2016 initiative, which is focused on ending veteran and chronic homelessness by the end of 2016. It's a campaign-style strategy that tries to identify the most important data so you can make real-time improvements. It's not listed here, but another important technical assistance initiative that's being pushed forward in communities is the Vets at Home strategy. Now, if you work for a continuum of care and you're trying to better understand, oh, how can I better serve veterans in my community? Maybe I'm in a rural balance of state, not sure what to do. There's some resources put together by the Vets at Home team to support you in that effort. And they're free and they're available, and we can include links to them later if that's something that you're interested in. So, all right, so where does that take us? Where are we now? So many communities across the country have actually reached functional zero systems, and this is to be applauded. If you're part of one of these communities, congratulations. We recognize that although you have reached a federally recognized system for ending veteran homelessness, your work isn't done. Now, New Orleans in Louisiana was the first community to declare that they had reached a functional end of veteran homelessness. And I talked to them a couple hours later after they had made that declaration and the next day. And you know what they said? Well, we're working harder now than we were before. And that's continued. And I know with all of these communities and within these states that that's an effort that has continued for the long term. So what does that mean about how we're defining functional zero? Now, there's a whole lot of words here, and I'll leave it to you to read, but I want to make a couple of recommendations for you as you're thinking through your community system and trying to better understand how you're assessing whether your community has reached functional zero and how close you are to getting to those federal benchmarks. The first part is, don't be so quick to worry about these pieces that you lose sight of the veterans you're serving. It happens in a lot of communities, and don't be afraid to use some selective shaming with your partners if you think they're a little bit more worried about capturing data than they are about the veterans they're serving. We're all on the same team, and we're working to make sure that we reach an area where every community can declare that they've reached a system that's responsive and able to serve the needs of every veteran who comes in the door. Now, the federal definition of functional zero, which was developed by USICH and is adopted by all the federal agencies that are involved in this process, recognizes that homelessness should be a brief, a rare, and a non-recurring episode. Importantly, like I mentioned before, the system be sustainable for the long term. So that doesn't mean you reach a functional zero point, you shake hands with everyone, and the door's closed and the movement is over. Importantly, if you look at the resources developed for this functional zero definition, you'll see that the grant and per diem program, which I've mentioned earlier, actually plays a key role specifically for veterans. It's included as a longer-term service intervention that offers stable and secure environments to veterans as they're leaving the streets. And in other cases, it offers a bridge out of homelessness for those who may be on the road to permanent housing placement but need a safe, stable place to stay in the meantime. These might be veterans that were otherwise served through the shelter system or stayed homeless until they reached permanent housing. Maybe they're waiting for a HUD-VASH voucher to come through. They're waiting on a landlord to approve their application. They're saving up a little bit of money through their job so they could pay a security deposit, these kind of things. The federal definition recognizes that if you have a system with transitional housing through the grant and per diem program, these are really important roles you can play in your community, and they're part of this system that has long-term stability. Now, in communities where the continuum of care deprioritized transitional housing, and if your COC saw a significant cut in transitional housing capacity through the COC after this last reapplication process, you might have an additional opportunity if your organization has grant and per diem to fill in some of the gaps for veterans through this opportunity. Now, I'm going to stop here because I want to turn it over to Leon to talk about some of the interventions that have been successful. I hope that gave you a little bit of a snapshot of where we came from and the fact that when we started this work, there really wasn't a whole lot there, but through grit and determination and that realization that homelessness is not something that should ever happen, especially for veterans, and we can make sustained change for the long term to best meet the needs of veterans who come in our doors. Now, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back, but I'm looking forward to any of your questions, and thank you for your time.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Baylee. So our final panelist is Leon Winston, Chief Operating Officer here at Swords to Plowshares. Leon has worked in the housing, treatment, and income support needs for homeless veterans and low-income veterans since 1995, nationally recognized veterans advocate. Leon himself was referred to Swords to Plowshares by the San Francisco VA Medical Center as a homeless client in 1993 and went through and graduated from our own transitional housing program. Lo, these many years later, he is our Chief Operating Officer. He is also currently serving as a member of the VA Secretary's Advisory Committee on Homeless Veterans. He's on the Board of Directors of the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, of which Baylee, of course, you just heard, is the director. And in 2013, he was recipient of the first Veterans Champion Award bestowed by the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Leon is a veteran of the U.S. Navy, and he will take it away now. Welcome, Leon.
Well, thank you, Amy, and Megan and Baylee for imparting a lot of information. I hope there isn't too much background noise. For some reason, a helicopter has decided to hover over my office for the last 2 minutes. Hopefully it'll go away. So I wanted to talk about the how these strategies to end veteran homelessness, what it's like on the pavement, what's happening in communities, how these efforts that Baylee so clearly outlined, how they're working in local communities. And my main point of reference will be here in San Francisco, but I think for the most part, it can be adapted to any community, and they're pretty consistent across communities. First of all, as Baylee mentioned, this effort to end veteran homelessness is a bit of a misnomer. Veteran homelessness, or homelessness for any population, will not end. But if we have our systems in place and adequate resources, instances can be less common. They could be limited to episodic and be of a short duration. And we can end chronic veteran homelessness. Keys to successes are the right intervention at the right time. And this all has to be tied to the availability of adequate targeted resources. And targeting is very important in this. Before I move on, I've been doing this work for many years now. We used to be, we being the larger homeless provider community, we're almost accused of just managing homelessness, not ending it. And that's a bit insulting, but there's a certain kernel of truth in that, because we never had adequate resources to really make the huge dent. And of course, we all did our best and continue to address the suffering that's before us. So, so it's a bit of a change in focus, but it all has to be based upon adequate and targeted resources. Barbara Poppy, who was the executive director of USICH when the Opening Doors Plan was issued, she called it moving to a crisis response model, and that's something that I really took to heart and I think really makes sense. Homelessness is a crisis in our communities in large, and it is certainly a crisis for the individuals experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. So if we are able to look at that as a crisis response, I think it informs how we provide our services and what services we need to put in place. Some of the best practices that have been put forward are the adoption of housing first protocols, which I'll talk more about in a second, and for veterans specifically, a homeless veteran registry and establishing a coordinated entry system. The resources and program components were talked about by Baylee, but those homeless prevention, the SSVF program provides funding for that. And prevention also includes income supports and employment. So through the Veterans Benefit Administration, the SOAR program, which you don't know is funded by SAMHSA, it's an SSI, SSDI, it stands for Outreach, Access, and Recovery. So it's getting expedited SSDI process for homeless individuals. And once again, the single greatest predictor for homelessness is poverty. I know that behavioral health, mental health, and other conditions, criminal justice, are huge factors, but poverty is at the root of it all. So SSVF also provides rapid rehousing with temporary financial assistance, both on the prevention side and on the rapid rehousing side. Bridge and stabilization housing and safe havens. Baylee talked quite a bit about the GPD program. The VA also has a healthcare for homeless veterans program, which is contracted locally out of medical centers to provide shorter-term stabilization housing, such as for veterans leaving psychiatric inpatient units, establishing safe havens, extremely low barrier housing, temporary housing for homeless veterans who are treatment resistant. Then the GPD program is still in place and will stay that way. And it can be used for services-intensive transitional housing as well as for bridge housing. The permanent supportive housing, which is largely HUD-VASH, but also through COC, Continuum of Care Resources. And this is very important for the 15 to 20% of homeless veterans who are not eligible for HUD-VASH, for the so-called bad paper issues that Megan referred to. So it's important to be able to leverage continuum of care and be involved in the continuum of care to bring these resources to bear for that 15 or so % of homeless veterans who aren't eligible for VA health care and therefore are not eligible for HUD-VASH. And of course, affordable housing availability, and that's something huge in many of our communities, in San Francisco in particular. So the strategies or best practices. Housing first. It's been around a while. There's been some, in different quarters, other resistance to it in the traditional GPD community because of it's a different orientation towards the work for many, many years. That's changing. So housing first, there are no preconditions to being offered permanent housing. Housing is considered a human right, not a reward for behavior modification. It does not mean housing only, but services are voluntary. But that said, there are strategies one uses, including harm reduction strategies, motivational interviewing using stages of change model, and assertive case management, all are necessary. In some instances, stabilization or bridge housing may be needed as permanent housing options are developed. Often our homeless veteran clients don't have the documentation, almost always they don't have the documentation necessary, say, to that the housing authority will require for voucher issuance on HUD-VASH, the BD 214, which is their evidence of military service, other things. So these shorter-term housing interventions are still very necessary. The veteran registry. This is a by-name list of every homeless veteran in a given community. It's updated regularly. And we have one here in San Francisco and quite a few communities. Every community that has reached this functional zero has adopted this veteran registry. So, and veterans on that registry are prioritized for services based upon triage or other criteria. The vulnerability index is one that basically, the higher score, the more likely the individual is to die on the street if not provided housing. In San Francisco, the local continuum of care prefers using length of time homelessness, like length of time homeless, in order to prioritize those veterans for or individuals for permanent supportive housing with the resources that they control. And so the prioritization is based upon need. One of the things that talk about a bit more later is that in the 5-year sort of surge of resources, a lot of the resources weren't really targeted very well, and that's why we haven't made as much progress as we might have, in my opinion anyway, in ending veteran homelessness in some communities. And coordinated entry. I like to refer to it as sort of a match.com for homeless veterans in housing, or for homeless individuals or families in housing. And it's based upon the idea that homeless or at-risk individuals shouldn't have to navigate their way through multiple waiting lists and be in multiple spots at the same time in order to access housing. So localities develop a coordinated entry system. There's usually a software platform associated with it. And so veterans prioritize, say, for permanent supportive housing, are on that list and matched with that housing as it becomes available. Others who are not in need of permanent supportive housing but may need rapid rehousing are referred to, say, the SSVF program. They may be referred to the GPD program, either for bridge housing or for services intensive transitional housing for up to 2 years, based upon their choice. But this does require a coordinated effort across with local government, nonprofit, and your partners, your housing authority, your VA, HUD, and also establishing a release of information so that we can all talk about the needs of Joe Veteran as we get together as a group of individuals and agencies that are all working for the same goal of ending veteran homelessness in the community. So this is what our crisis response system looks like here at SWORDS. This was actually developed for a different purpose, so it basically shows all the boxes in gray happen to be programs that we offer here in-house, and those in blue are external to us, but they're all very necessary components of a system, and these all utilize all the programs and services that Baylee spoke of. So this coordinated intake, coordinated assessment, triage and assessment happens with the veteran registry and the coordinated entry system. Here you have case manager assignment or navigator assignment. Navigators can be an important tool, often a peer, someone who has experienced homelessness, who helps the veteran sort of navigate their way through the system, whether it be make appointments at the housing authority to get their voucher, whatever the case may be. And the referral should always be a warm handoff. It doesn't just go and sign in at XYZ agency, but making a call from one case manager to say, I'm sending Joe over for this purpose. And so it's all part of this coordinated entry and veteran registry system. So if I'm an at-risk veteran or family household, I would come in and I'd be referred into the homeless prevention program, which provides addiction prevention services through temporary financial assistance. It might help you find new housing if you need to move from your existing housing or about to be homeless. It also can be representative payee services or be made available if you have a history of not paying your rent, and we can tell the landlord in cooperation with you as the client that Joe's VA pension check is going to come to us, and we're going to cut your rent check every month for it. He's agreed to do that so that you can be sure the rent is paid. That's a useful tool. And of course, other sources like credit counseling, child care, legal aid, and VA medical care, community outpatient treatment, etc. And of course, as we keep saying, the importance of income and the link to poverty. So it's also referrals to employment training and benefits acquisition. Very important as a preventative tool. If you're homeless as you come in, the assessment is done. You may need just rapid rehousing, which would make that referral, help you find that housing, offers temporary financial assistance to pay first and last, provide a shallow subsidy for a period of time, referral to emergency or stabilization housing or transitional housing as stated before, and from there, from either of those points into affordable permanent housing if that meets your needs, or permanent supportive housing if that is indicated as the necessary pathway out of homelessness for the individual. So the rapid rehousing program, this is the SSVF program, streamlines the response to end homelessness for veterans, and it's been working very well. It's also not just for those that are going to the regular rental market. Often those who are going into HUD-VASH or other permanent supportive housing, they still need some assistance. Be able to pay a security deposit. There are many other things. The breadth of the allowable uses of the temporary financial system is quite broad, and can be anything from, okay, I can't keep my apartment because I can't get to work because my car needs repair and I can't afford to get it fixed. We can pay for that. Just a large variety of interventions that are available, and same for preventative services. All of this is based on the crisis response triage and referral to have the needed supports. So Baylee talked about, to some degree, about modernizing, I think she said, the GPD program, which is the historic transitional housing program that the DA operated, and it was its main, its only community-based grant program for homelessness for many years. The GPD program is currently authorized by Congress, and it's here to stay. There's been a lot of dialogue and debate about transitional housing over the years, especially at the COC, continuing care level, and HUD has deprioritized transitional housing, as folks may know. Local COCs have been encouraged to reallocate transitional housing dollars that are coming through HUD dollars to either rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing uses. And so GPD is sort of within that, and when the 5-year plan was put together and the 25 cities efforts, it was sort of left off the table. Nobody was really wanting to talk about GPD. It was transitional housing bad, and that was unfortunate. Does transitional housing need to change? Does it need to be not our only response to homelessness? Absolutely. But I'll use myself as an example. 4 years ago, I was a homeless vet. I had substance abuse issues, I had mental health issues, and I had been unemployed for quite a long time. So I went in, I was referred after inpatient in the hospital to our transitional housing program, a time where I stayed 11 months. That allowed me to get my act together, clean myself up, get some health care needs attended to, and find a job. I didn't need referral to the equivalent of HUD-VASH. I didn't need an ongoing housing subsidy. I needed an opportunity to get back on my feet. And if we do away with that resource, I think we do a big disservice to the system as it is for those veterans who are going to go back to work, who are not going to require an ongoing subsidy in order to be successful and have their period of homelessness in the rearview mirror permanently. So that's my pitch there. That's not to say that it doesn't need to change. It services intensive transitional housing, as I said, is still a very necessary tool for exiting homelessness for our veterans. But it can't be the only tool. And it can't be that if you're a homeless veteran, you are required to go through this program and to graduate it in order to earn housing. That flies in the face of housing first, and that's sort of where the transitional housing model has run afoul of national best practices as they move forward. So one of the changes that's occurring is allowing using the GPD bids for bridge housing, which means a veteran who is in housing search, perhaps with the SSVF program, needs a place to stay, or that needs permanent supportive housing, but waiting for a slot to open up for them, or waiting for them to get the paperwork necessary to access that housing. Being allowed for that use if providers so choose, which is, I think, important. Also, the utilization of, but the GPD program otherwise has pretty high barriers. It might be called, those have been lowered in some cases. We lowered ours here, but there's certain statutory reasons it can't lower them to the degree that some would like to. This really has to do with substance use. They are required by statute to be clean and sober environments, to be maintained that way. And that can be a problem. But there are other low barrier and shorter term options. The VA does fund a few safe havens. We have one here that we operate. This is for unsheltered veterans who are treatment resistant. They are not willing to consider a life of abstinence or an extended period of abstinence. They can come and go when they want to. Services are voluntary. They just can't bring drugs and alcohol into the site. They have their own room, but they can go out and use and come back. And it's been working. They gradually built some trust with staff, and were able to help a great number of them move into permanent supportive housing from that intervention. As mentioned, the services intensive GPD program is offered as an option to homeless veterans, but not the way that the VA is moving is that it not be a requirement before being assisted with finding permanent housing. So the model that's been put forth is that it's up to the veteran's choice. And some of them may opt not to go into the services enriched, and they may fail as a result of substance abuse or other issues in maintaining housing, say in the regular rental market with HUD-Dash, and may ultimately opt for services intensive for a longer period of time. But it's based upon their choice. And what this means in the long run for the transitional housing programs, some of them, as veteran homelessness becomes less common, the numbers go down. Probably there'll be some excess capacity in places, and the VA is looking at bed utilization at providers to see if they should reallocate some of those resources elsewhere if the demand is no longer as high in the communities where those beds are located as it once was. One thing in metropolitan areas such as San Francisco, especially those with low vacancy rates, high rents, this goes for Los Angeles, all up and down the West Coast, New York, many places. The HUD-Dash program was based upon this Pathways to Housing model out of East Coast, which is a scattered site. And it never really looked at project-basing the vouchers in order to create housing opportunities outside of the regular rental market for homeless veterans. It's working in some places that way, in places largely with not huge numbers of chronically homeless, highly vulnerable, difficult to serve veterans, and with an abundance of available affordable housing. In places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, et cetera, it is not working. These veterans are, if they're able to find housing with the housing choice voucher, they often can't keep it. Supports just aren't robust enough at the VA DASH program in order for them to maintain their housing. And we've found over the years that single-site permanent supportive housing is needed. There seems to be more willingness on the VA's part and HUD's part to do that now that they've seen that we still have a lot of chronically homeless veterans out there in many of these communities who are unable to get housed with the regular DASH voucher. And so these are typically, our typical tenant is 45 to 70 with the age-related illnesses appearing 10, 15 years earlier, as Megan pointed out in her piece on demographics. They're often not adequately served by HUD-Dash. They can't compete in the regular rental market as stated, or they have difficulty in remaining housed over time. They're bad exits from HUD-Dash, as they say. But it's not for all veterans. Some veterans with certain mental health issues find the setting to be too stimulating, and other options are needed. But the benefits are they have services are on site, so there's economies of scale. Really able to tailor the housing to the needs of the veterans. They're able to age in place, and they have access to a flexible array of services on site. And many veterans, as Baylee was talking about stand down, when you're living with a community of veterans, there's a certain esprit de corps that's inherent in that, or can be if it's fostered. And there's a very therapeutic nature to that. And so it can really help outcomes, a community of veterans living together. you need sufficient numbers of dedicated units. Of course, you need funding for the on-site support to make that happen. So, but that feeds into more thoughtful use of resources. So, as I mentioned earlier, with the big sort of surge in funding in the beginning of the 5-year plan, there was a bit of ready, shoot, aim, as I like to put it, that there wasn't really any strategic planning done locally to see how these federal resources could best be used. This is happening more now. 25 Cities effort was part of that as well, to really sort of tailor these federal resources in particular to local needs and to local strategic planning processes to see what the needs are in a given community. So that's happening now. We would have, of course, liked it to have happened 5-6 years ago. I think we'd be in better shape if it had, but better late than never. So we're still working towards that through advocacy through NCHV and through other sources, working to see that that happens in our communities. Most of for those of you who are very familiar with the COCs, the Community Continuum Care, you know that in 1995, local communities were empowered and required to create these local planning bodies in order to decide how best to allocate scant HUD homeless resources within their communities. The VA had never really been part of that process, and VA resources had never been part of that process. The SSVF program and its surge funding a couple of years ago finally became part of that process, and I think that's a very beneficial thing. Veterans come from communities, they're homeless in communities, and need to be a community response to address it. And stated, it is a crisis response model that we need. If we have the resources, we should treat individual homelessness, individual threats of homelessness, and widespread homelessness as a crisis that it is for the community and the individual. And that requires sustained resources that are targeted appropriately and a sustained commitment by all involved. Here's some acronyms that Baylee really went through pretty well, so I won't. And now we'd open it up to questions. Amy, back to you.
Thank you, Leon. That was great. And thank you to all our presenters, Megan and Baylee. We'd now like to open up for discussion with the audience. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them via the question or chat box, which is on the right side of your screen, and we'll do our best to get through them all. And also for those of you who asked questions earlier during the presentations, I've noted them, and I will be presenting them now. So we have a number of really good questions. I'm going to start off with one that I'm going to pose to Leon, because I think it's really very much an issue here in San Francisco, and it's talking about in communities like San Francisco where there has been an influx of money, which has caused the housing markets to really go crazy. There's a lot of development, but not necessarily affordable housing. What efforts are underway, or how have you sort of looked to that for us to be able to find housing for our veterans here in San Francisco? And the same is true, I would assume, for many other cities. I know there's a couple cities in Texas that are growing like crazy and probably have the same issues.
Sure. Is my mic still live?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, that's the big question: supply, supply, supply. We've done some. San Francisco's done some pretty innovative things. In San Francisco, we happen to have a large inventory of residential hotels that were built early to mid last century. San Francisco was much more of a military town. We had a busy port here, and it was a Navy town. So there was a lot of demand for sort of transient housing. So there's this large stock of single-room occupancy, largely hotels that are residential on purpose. That's basically the for better or worse, the only housing option for impoverished people, largely, unless they have a housing subsidy elsewhere in San Francisco. And so one of the tools that's been used is to master lease these buildings to make sure that they're in good repair, that they meet housing quality standards, and that these units are being made available to homeless populations. We have several that are veteran specific. More ideally is that we build the housing, but that takes time. There were, as I was mentioned about the single site transfer of housing developments, had we started, there's been a reticence to allow, from HUD and the VA, to allow these HUD-dash vouchers to be used to leverage the financing necessary to build affordable housing. And that's a whole nother discussion. But when we can do that, then we can really provide much higher quality housing for these veterans. Swords has several hundred such units, and we have more in development here. And mainly through our SSVF program, for our rapid rehousing program, we're just having to look further afield. Veterans are moving further out. There's sort of been a reverse migration, if you will, in the cities. There used to be there was a, I guess they called it white flight or whatever, the middle class moving out of urban centers. Now, especially the young middle class folks want to be in urban centers, and it's forcing poorer people further afield, which has a burden of added cost for transportation, but cheaper housing. So that's a phenomenon that's happening here. And closer communities to San Francisco, their rents are going up too. So it hasn't stopped, and it's not going to stop anytime soon, unfortunately. Other options that you try to encourage folks to have is roommates. Maybe you can't afford to live by yourself, but perhaps you can find a roommate situation. We have situations where two veterans with HUD-dash vouchers decide to share a unit. One three-bedroom apartment where three veterans are sharing, all have separate HUD-dash subsidies, and together it's sufficient to rent that size of unit. So you have to be creative, and but you have to create. We all have to do what we can to create affordable housing stock.
And then with the HUD-VASH themselves, and Baylee, you might be able to jump in here too. Have there been, I'm not sure if there's been efforts in different areas where they've increased the amount of funding that's allowed for.
Yeah, I can speak to that.
Yeah.
And I don't want to cut you off, Baylee, but that's
go right ahead.
Phenomenon.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, in San Francisco and other places, the amount of the subsidy available through the housing choice vouchers simply is not competitive with the actual fair market rents in the community. It's a rather arcane process where HUD decides each year what the fair market rent is in the community. It's usually data from several years prior. It just hasn't been competitive in San Francisco. So San Francisco Housing Authority, and working with the mayor's office and the was able to get a waiver from HUD to get a higher value, if you will, per voucher, so that they're more competitive within the regular rental market. The downside of that is that when a housing authority is say, allocated 100 vouchers, there's a set amount of subsidy that comes with that. I'm not sure how that's worked out. So if you increase that basis subsidy, then it ends up being fewer vouchers. But at least the veterans are getting housed. So it's a bit of a two-edged sword.
Okay. Here's a question that I think both of you could speak to, but I'm going to pose it to Baylee. Are there efforts to increase the coordination between veteran homelessness and civil legal services, and the ability to pay for those civil legal services through national grant sources? So this is, I would think family issues and other civil legal needs that the homeless veterans need, and that those are creating a barrier to housing or to employment or causing financial problem. So Baylee, are there resources for that, or any talk of increasing the ability to use federal resources for civil legal help?
Yeah, so I'll speak on a couple of pieces related to legal more broadly. And Leon, I think if you want to talk a little bit about the leadership that SWORDS has taken in pushing forward legal services for veterans who are homeless, I think your model is one that can be emulated in a lot of other places. But if you look at the high unmet needs, I mean, you're right. Whoever asked that question is spot on, and others who are working with this population know legal issues are consistently brought up as barriers to accessing housing, accessing, or reconnecting back to family, accessing competitive employment. So the issue is definitely there. There are some initiatives that have taken place, and usually it's community by community, to integrate legal services more fully into prevention and homelessness ending programming. A great example is actually in the state of Minnesota. They've been able to leverage their SSVF, their supportive services for veteran families dollars, to build a more robust legal network among the SSVF providers in that state to serve clients coming through the SSVF program. Something that's been suggested is the possibility of, if you've got several SSVF programs that are operating in one area, for them to maybe be able to pool some of their resourcing together to pay for legal services that independently one of them wouldn't be able to fully pay for, but that together they can then afford. So that's using existing federal resources to pay for legal support. There are a couple scattered pieces of legislation on the national side that are trying to build forward paying for legal services for veterans who are homeless and at risk. There's not a whole lot of traction moving those forward, but it's definitely something that we're cognizant of, and trying to advance. Usually those initiatives to provide legal care are community by community. We've seen that through the growth of things like the veteran treatment courts all across the country, where jail diversion models are being used to ensure that veterans who are dealing with substance use issues or mental health issues aren't having to cycle in and out of the criminal justice system before they're connected back to. That's used as a great prevention tool and as a homelessness ending tool, although it's not specific to that. Leon, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about what SWORDS is doing in that effort. And I know that's a broader view in response to that question. And we're happy to get you connected to some of the policy work that's being done around that specific issue if you want to follow up with me in particular, whoever asked that question.
Yeah, so thank you, Baylee. The legal work that SWORDS does as far as representation and direct legal assistance to veterans is pretty much limited to VA benefits and access to VA health care. We have attorneys here on staff that handle cases directly, and we also have developed a pro bono program where we have actually trained large numbers of attorneys to handle veterans' claims. And this is very important for the more complex cases where there are multiple injuries, et cetera. It's very important that the veteran's claim be adjudicated properly and presented properly the first time, because if it isn't, if it's denied or insufficient compensation is awarded based upon an incomplete claim, the appeals process can take years. So it already takes long enough to get a claim adjudicated. So that's a very important piece. And I assume some of these pro bono partners are also handling more other civil matters and possible criminal matters for some of these veterans. And I know we make referrals to the local bar association because there's a pro bono program available through the local bar association for referral for homeless, particularly for homeless individuals and low-income individuals. But as far as national funding for anything, nothing that I know of. As Baylee mentioned, the SSVF program can be used for that purpose, but not for VA claims, as it's currently, as current regs are being interpreted. But it can be used for eviction defense and child support and all these other things. but the amount of temporary financial assistance available per client is pretty limited. So as you mentioned, you have to be creative. Multiple agencies possibly working together to make that work.
Yeah, the other piece too, like you mentioned, Leon, connecting to the local bar association. So the American Bar Association has a commission on homelessness and poverty, and they're really great about trying to connect local programs to available pro bono resources. They really don't exist everywhere, but where they do exist, it's a great opportunity to try and use that support, or maybe get involved with a local legal aid clinic to try to build up legal resources. There's a high need there, and it's definitely an underserved piece of this work.
And there are quite a few, I think it's growing legal clinics happening for veterans via medical centers and elsewhere, law schools. So that's another resource to look at in given communities.
Okay, I'm going to turn a little bit to the eviction question, which is, having services around SSVF, supportive services for veterans and families, and being able to intervene on that kind of prevention side is relatively new. Can you talk a little bit more about the specific services that you're providing, if there's challenges in the way that the SSVF grants are structured in order to address eviction prevention, and of course, once again, in these high-pressure housing markets, if there's an increase in evictions going on.
Yeah.
And either of you.
Okay, I could take a shot at that initially.
So, go for it, Leon.
Yeah. Thank you, Baylee. The SSVF program, as mentioned, one of the allowable uses is for prevention. A smaller percentage of the grant can be used for that than can be used for rapid rehousing. That's, I think, based on two things. One, trying to drive to zero, but they're already homeless. And the other is that research hasn't really shown that prevention money is is necessary. For example, I know that sounds kind of cold-hearted, but there was a study done on the HPRP program a few years back that was a rapid rehousing and prevention program, and it showed that a large percentage of those who did not receive eviction prevention temporary financial assistance were able to resolve their situation without having it. So there's less of an impetus by the VA to provide that funding. That said, it's still very important. There are tools that we can use. With SSVF, you can offer a landlord several months of security deposit rather than 1 month if you want to. You can provide a subsidy for up to 9 months, so the amount available per client is, in a market like ours, that isn't really feasible to any large extent because the rents are so high. There's the money management program that I mentioned, the representative payee program, that you can use SSVF funds to institute, or you can utilize. Here in San Francisco, Lutheran Social Services is a big provider for that. We do it, it's free to the veteran, but they do, I think, there's a nominal fee. But those are basically it. And with our case managers, telling them that, give Joe another chance. We're working with them. If there's any problems, give us a call, and we'll do our best to intervene and make sure that you're kept whole. That's about it from the local perspective.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add to that is just to confirm what Leanne mentioned right in the beginning too, which is it's really, really difficult to predict who is going to wind up homeless. We know that prior experiences with homelessness is one of those significant predictors, but it's really difficult to know whether a veteran who has a HUD-VASH voucher will actually wind up experiencing homelessness again if they don't receive some prevention support. And I think what the crux of that challenge is ensuring that veterans who are in the HUD-VASH program have really good case management services, so that challenges they're experiencing, which are inevitable to come up from time to time, are being addressed immediately through that case management process. Having done case management for SSVF clients and having had a couple that are also leased up with HUD-VASH, I've seen that that a lot of the challenges came from issues that could have been resolved earlier within their HUD-VASH case management process and didn't necessarily need to involve the financial support of an SSVF program. Oftentimes that does end up happening because they might be getting supplemental case management support through that SSVF, but I think oftentimes the real challenge for those veterans in VASH comes back to insufficient HUD-VASH case management, not necessarily the fault of that case manager. A lot of times they have far too many clients and they're traveling way too far between each of those, and so they don't have enough time to spend with that veteran to make sure that they're stable. But that's something that's very high on our radar, and that we're trying to do our best to rectify to make sure that veterans who are using that resource are connected to good case management so they could stay stable for the long term.
Yeah, veterans that are in a permanent supportive housing program such as HUD-VASH shouldn't be ending up in that boat very often. Unfortunately, it is happening too often, and especially in the Housing Choice Voucher program. But most of the prevention demand is in the regular rental market, the unsubsidized housing arena, and that's where we see most of our SSVF eviction prevention potential clients come in with, not through a supportive housing model.
Okay. Let's see. So we're coming up. We have about 7 minutes left in our webcast. There are two things, two questions. One is Megan talked a little bit about the numbers of the risk among women veterans. We know that there are fewer hard numbers of them, but the rates of homelessness are going up. And Baylee, I'd like to ask you if you've seen models or initiatives around the country that look promising for reaching out, preventing, and or responding to women veteran homelessness.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different steps to that, right? And some of these might, sound like no-brainers, but they're incredibly important and are often missed. The first part is on the outreach side. In order to best meet the needs of female veterans who are experiencing homelessness, we need to know who they are and where they are, so that on the national level we can be advocating for the resources to serve that population. So part of that is built into the outreach process, including the point-in-time count, but going beyond that to make sure the outreach workers who are working with the general homeless population are aware of the number of female veterans that might be within that population. It's still a fairly small number of the overall population of veterans who are homeless, so it's also important to keep in mind. It's small but significant. So the first part of that would be making sure there's appropriate outreach. A second part, and this is related to female veterans, and part of the growth of the numbers of female veterans experiencing homelessness, I think, spurred the attention to this issue, but it goes beyond female veterans to just veterans overall, and people who have experienced homelessness overall. It's awareness of the importance of trauma-informed care and building trauma-informed principles within your agency. Having an awareness and an understanding of the impacts of military sexual trauma, and how you can have a constructive conversation with someone who might have experienced that trauma, or just general trauma within your agency. There's some great resources that are available for the individuals in your agency. Again, these are free resources to help you build some sort of trauma-informed competency in your agency so you're best able to serve that population. And again, I think that was the focus on that issue has been brought on by awareness of female veterans within the homeless veteran population. but it applies more broadly. So the first part being outreach, the second part being awareness and trauma-informed principles and building those into every step of your agency's process of service delivery. Another part is making sure that there's accessible resources for female veterans who may or may not have dependent children with them. There is a challenge making sure that those individuals are able to connect to immediate shelter or some sort of transitional housing program, because a lot of the programs that are out there to serve veterans coming quickly off the street were built for single veterans and also male veterans. There are certain programs that have been able to build in, say, a separate locked wing for the female veterans in their program, or they have been able to, maybe lease a separate building that they can use for their GPD program. Oftentimes the transition in place GPD programs, so the TIP programs, are able to build in a structure where they could have female veterans or veterans with dependent children living in an independent unit where they have that safety and that security that they might not have in a more congregate living situation. There are some best practices around how TIP has been able to do that, and I would encourage you to look into those a little bit more deeply. The last piece of that would be on the income stability component. So if you're working with, and this applies to all veterans, but just being aware of the needs of female veterans or female homeless individuals that you might not think are veterans unless you're asking the right questions, making sure that they are quickly connected to the income stability so that they can obtain and maintain housing. Oftentimes, if you're working at a homeless service agency, you might be connecting people through SOAR to their Social Security benefits, but you need to make sure that if you're working with a veteran, male or female, that you're also trying to help them get connected to their VA benefits and the income and employment programs that exist. So there's a lot of different moving pieces. There are some best practices that are emerging. The need is there. It's a small but significant population, and for those that have dependent children, a big component of that is making sure that there's safety and security built into their immediate housing needs. And SSVF does allow for a longer-term emergency support payment for something like a hotel or a motel for someone who does come in with dependent children. It's a little bit longer in time. I think that it's 30 days. I don't remember off the top of my head, but there is that allowability for the SSVF program if they build that into their budget to pay for emergency housing for that population for a little bit longer.
Okay, we're coming right up until the end. I want to just quickly ask, with regard to functional zero and maintaining that, we have a specific question about people being timed out of money management after a year. But if you could sort of segue that into, what else you would want to see if you could to maintain people in their housing.
Well, yeah, being timed out of money management, I assume that has to do with the SSVF money management capacity. It is an issue. You might have to transfer to another source. There may be resistance from the veteran on that because there may be a fee of $10 or $20 a month, and when you're only getting a small amount of income, that can be a lot of money to some people. Ideally, people learn to that they want their rent paid, they stabilized. Ideally, they will do so. But there are some individuals that, as we know, especially those with significant mental health issues, there's a portion of those that will really need money management services in the long run. That's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. So once again, but for those individuals, the single site permanent supportive housing tends to work a lot better because the property management and services work very closely together. They both have the same mission. And in the regular rental market, the landlords may want to help veterans, but their mission isn't to end veteran homelessness, it's to have revenue. So there is a difference. So we need the infrastructure of single-site permanent supportive housing units to help keep those veterans who are most vulnerable, who have the most difficulty in managing their money, get and stay housed. I don't know what other resources there may be, but those are the two things I can add to that.
Okay, well, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, Baylee?
No, I was just going to say I don't have much more to add than that because that's solid. So.
Okay. Okay. We're going to wrap it up. I want to thank all of our presenters, Megan Zottarelli, Baylee Crone, and Leon Winston. I also think that, we're at this point after, where we can really look at the lessons learned from the beginning of these efforts when, as Leon said, it was ready, shoot, aim, and dig in and look at best practices and where we need to go from here. So I'm really happy we were able to do this today. I also want to thank all of our listeners for joining us. You will each receive an email at the end of our business day to ask you to complete a brief evaluation survey of our presentation. Your feedback is really important to us. We very much appreciate it. It helps us craft new programming, and it helps us learn what's going on out there and how we can help you. Those who are seeking continuing education units or certificates of completion will need to complete this information in order to receive credit for participating in the training. We also plan to archive this presentation on our YouTube channel, as we do with all of our webinars. That will be up in the next few business days, and we'll send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation as well. Again, thank you for your time. This concludes our presentation, and you may all now disconnect. Thank you.